Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel and to the 86th edition of the Rolling Stone. Hope that you guys are staying safe and staying free as you can and as safe as you can in this brave new world that we've found ourselves in, where everything continues to change on the turn of a dime, or I should say at the drop of a dime. Everything keeps changing, and the dimes are falling thick and heavy, and it's not going to stop. I hate again to be the bluebird of gloom. Actually, the bluebird of gloom, that's not exactly right. What would it be? The crow of doom, or the raven of doom, or something like that. Or the bluebird of doom I like too, because you usually think of bluebirds as soft, fluffy bluebirds of happiness, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, it's going to keep going, gang, unfortunately. And our first story proves it. So they're starting to nominate people, the elites. They're starting to nominate people for Nobel Peace Prizes, and you will never guess in a million years who was actually nominated for an actual, honest to God, Nobel Peace Prize. Okay, just take a wild guess. If you guessed Black Lives Matter, give yourself a gold star. Yes, gang! The actual Marxist neo-terrorist mobocracy known as Black Lives Matter has been officially nominated to receive a Nobel Peace Prize. And no, this is not The Onion or the Babylon Bee. 5 years ago, you would have only found this sort of idea in one of those publications or in a similarly themed magazine. But no, this headline comes to us from USA Today. Black Lives Matter nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for carrying forward a movement of racial justice. The guy who actually nominated Black Lives Matter isn't even an American. He's a Norwegian member of parliament. He's a member of the Norwegian parliament. I don't know why I said that with a pseudo-French accent, probably because I can't do a Norwegian accent. I can talk like the Swedish chef, but I can't do Norwegians. But anyway, Norwegian Member of Parliament Peter Eide, I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, E-I-D-E, said he nominated the organization because it is bringing forward a new consciousness and awareness about racial justice. Eddie said Black Lives Matter carries forward the legacy of earlier racial justice movements, such as the civil rights movement in the US and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, and Albert Luthuli and Nelson Mandela won the prize in 1960 and 1993, respectively, for their campaigns against racial discrimination in South Africa. Okay, let us just pause, full stop right there, and address one of the first of several elephants in the room. Let's say that Black Lives Matter is actually what it pretends to be. That it is just a peaceful movement of protesters who are advocating peacefully for change, for the better harmonizing of racial relationships in the United States, okay? Let's say that it's not a Marxist organization. Let's say that it's not a movement that is seeped and drowned and baptized in violence and anger and hatred and all the rest of that good stuff that we know is true, okay? Let's, for the sake of argument, just say that it is what the narrative says that it is. Even if that were true, gang, the idea that Black Lives Matter is on par with the civil rights movement or with Nelson Mandela's anti-apartheid movement, or that somehow Black Lives Matter, and this is even more to the key point, that somehow Black Lives Matter has started this international conversation about race, okay? Because again, we saw Black Lives Matter like protests in England, in France. I think there were even some in Germany and Spain. I know definitely in France and in Britain there were some last summer after, of course, the whole George Floyd fiasco in Minneapolis. But even if, okay, Black Lives Matter was a peaceful organization, it would be asinine to suggest that it is the genesis of what has to become a global movement or a global conversation, because guess what? The rest of the world does not have the same racial history that the United States has. Britain, just to lay out one example, Britain abolished slavery much earlier than the United States. Well, actually, I shouldn't say much earlier. It was still in the 19th century, but I think that it was about 1832. I think it was 1832 that slavery was pretty much abolished in the British Empire. There were some loopholes left for the East India Trade Company, and I believe that those loopholes were closed off about 4 years later, 1836 thereabout. Before 1850, I know, those loopholes had been closed off, and slavery had been abolished throughout the British Empire, and that had been done peacefully, mostly through the works of a guy named William Wilberforce. Yeah, William Wilberforce, I believe. Wilberforce. Yeah, Wilberforce. And he argued, and he started this whole entire cultural shift, because he argued that the air of Britain was too pure for slavery. Okay? In the 18th century, remember, it was very, very common just to see 15, 16-year-old girls, 15, 16-year-old prostitutes on the streets, huddled in the street corners. And people would just walk by them because that was just the way that it was. That was just the way that it was. Okay? And so no one decided, hey, we're not going to change this. Wilberforce actually changed people's mentality about slavery, about minors having to sell themselves into prostitution just to keep themselves alive because they were basically living on the streets. Remember, there was no glorification of sex work. This was like, they were orphans, they couldn't get any jobs, and so out of desperation, they turned to the one thing that they thought could get them a little money. Wilberforce actually changed an entire culture, the entire culture and mindset of Britain through his work. Okay, great things. But that situation over there, much different from the situation over here in the United States, where you had the differentiation between the northern states and the southern states, the different cultures even, the invention of the cotton gin, King Cotton, and then the abolition movement, all of the slave uprisings, and then John Brown, of course, getting his hands dirty with all that, the American Civil War, Reconstruction, etc., etc., etc. The point being, our history of racial relations is not the same, is unique to us. It is not repeated exactly anywhere else in the world. And that's the same for every country. Every country is going to have a different history of racial relations, even if they have them at all, even, okay? Because again, not everyone has immigrated to every single part of the world. There are not very many, I would guess, there have not been very many Black people of African descent in, for example, let's say, Siberia, okay? Or Iceland. I'm not saying that there aren't any right now, but in the general course of history, that has not been the case. So, even then, this idea that BLM started this national conversation, or has started what should become a global conversation, is asinine. Because whatever conversations need to happen, they have to happen within the confines of a country itself and not blown up to the world, because guess what? There are very, 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 very few problems, if there are any at all, that have a global solution, because country and peoples and cultures and languages and histories and worldviews are different all across the world. That's the first thing. Now, to continue with this story, you might be thinking, but wait. Didn't Black Lives Matter cause a lot of damage? I mean, didn't it? And it's true. A study showed that up to 95% of all the riots last year in 2020 were linked to Black Lives Matter. But don't you know, MP Eide has an answer to that. Eide says, if we go 50 years back, those arguments that Black Lives Matter should not be nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize because it's a mob, it has used violent measures, those arguments also came up when Dr. Martin Luther King received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Exactly the same arguments. And when twice the African National Congress leaders of South Africa received the Nobel Peace Prize, there were also incidents of violence. But you can't use that as a counter-argument to say Mandela was not working for justice or peace. So there he is. He is conflating what's happening. He's conflating Black Lives Matter being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize with someone like Martin Luther King Jr. It's an argument specifically designed to bypass the brain and go directly to the heart. You don't want to say that Martin Luther King Jr. was undeserving of his Nobel Peace Prize, right? Well, the very same arguments that you're using, you bigot, to say why BLM shouldn't have a Nobel Peace Prize are the same arguments that were used by bigots like you when King was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Problem, however, is King, on general, was not calling for mobocracy. He was not calling for riots, okay? There is a speech that King gave in 1967, where he actually, unfortunately, I believe, unfortunately, he says that, well, the last 2 years, the long, hot summer, starting in 1965, or I don't know if, actually, no, I think the long, hot summer started after King's assassination in 1968, but 1965, 1967, there had been urban riots, okay, especially by young Black people. And there had been arson, there had been property destruction, and King in this speech tried to kind of say, well, yeah, I'm calling for nonviolence, but destruction of property, arson, those are different than actually mobs taking lives. That's totally different. That is just them trying to get attention. If you are destroying property, which again is not the same as taking a life, he says, life is sacred, property is just incidental. Arson, that's a little bit trickier, that's a little bit more worrisome, but at the end of the day, arson, like property destruction in general, it's just people trying to get attention because they want to be heard. So he unfortunately says that in this speech, but he does towards the end, he does actually generally come around and say that the civil rights movement cannot be violent if it actually wants to have long-term goals. It must be non-violent. Now, he does say that this is going to take determination, it's going to take strategic planning, and he basically does call for a sort of revolution, a non-violent revolution for racial justice. Even more racial justice, because again, remember, 1967, this is 2 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1965 has been signed into law. But for the most part, even though King was excusing rioters from destroying property and setting fire to stuff, he wasn't actively encouraging rioters to go out and do this. He basically was saying, yeah, it's not good, but I understand why they did it, and The very fact that they did that instead of actually killing people shows that nonviolence is the way to go. He kind of twisted it around so that it became proof of his own preordained conclusion, you might say. But the fact still remains that he said, look, where this is trying to be a peaceful protest, we can't resort to violence, okay? We can't start a guerrilla warfare. So the idea that simply because people were citing those riots of 1965, 1967, or in previous, when King was nominated for his Nobel Peace Prize, is not the same thing as people pointing out that Black Lives Matter has also caused huge amounts of damage deliberately in order for quote-unquote racial justice, okay? Because that leads us to something else. We not only have the destruction that Black Lives Matter causes, okay? Because even Black business owners have been destroyed by this. The vast majority of people who were hurt by the riots that Black Lives Matter instigated or caused or were linked to, again, 95% of the riots last year are linked to BLM, were the little people. It wasn't the government, it wasn't the corporations that took notice, it was the little people. Small business owners, white and black, hourly wage earners in those businesses, those are the people who were suffering. Black Lives Matter has caused inestimable damage in those areas. Even more so, the fact that Black Lives Matter is a Marxist organization that also supports ideologies like transgenderism means that it is an absolute enemy of mankind. It's not interested in peace. It's not interested in quote-unquote racial justice. It is interested in imposing a Marxist system onto not only our country, but on every other country that they can, where race is going to actually replace class. We're going backwards in a sense, where Marx said that it all comes down to class. Black Lives Matter is using the framework of Marx, but saying it all comes down to race. Race and ideology, because of course you have to be politically black you have to be politically black and racially black in order to be authentically black. No matter which way you slice or dice it, Black Lives Matter is undeserving of a Nobel Peace Prize. It's undeserving even of a nomination. This is pure Orwellian, and I think, gang, that is why this was happening, because this is, in my mind, a classic example of the I scratch your back, you scratch mine. What better way for old white lefties, okay? Because Peter Eide, who nominated Black Lives Matter, he's part of, guess what? Surprise, surprise, the Norwegian Socialist Party. This is a great way for people like Eide to wash themselves free of the sin of systematic oppression. Because remember, racial ideologues like Black Lives Matter believe that no matter how progressive you become, no matter how left-leaning, no matter how subservient you become, white people will always be racist because of the very fact that they are white people. Ibram Kendi, the guy who made that book, How Not to Be an Anti-Racist, we've talked about this before. He actually out and out said so. As long as basically white people are going to be racist, unless basically they are reprogrammed to not be quote-unquote racist. And he says being racist is whatever causes differences between two racial groups. That's racism in his book. It's not hatred for someone just because of the color of their skin. It's anything that causes differences between racial groups. So in Kendi's book, the intact nuclear family is racist. Because studies have proven that intact nuclear families actually enable children to thrive and achieve more in society. But guess which community does not have, in general, intact nuclear families? The black family. Divorce is through the roof. Abortion is through the roof. So by Kendi's own argument, the intact nuclear family is racist and it should be abolished. This is also the guy who said that the only cure for racism is actually racism. The only way to cure the racism of the past is racism now. Just reverse racism so that the people who were the beneficiaries of racism in the past are now made to suffer from they're made to suffer by racist policies now. Okay? So, what better way for white, progressive, lefty ideologues like Eide to wash themselves free than to nominate Black Lives Matter for something like a Nobel Peace Prize? Oh, don't hurt us. We're good people. We're good people. We are such good allies that we are going to nominate you for one of the most prestigious global awards that we have. Please don't hurt us. We're really good people. Please don't say that we're racist. This in turn then gives Black Lives Matter another veneer of respectability, because now not only does Black Lives Matter have to rely on propaganda from the media, entertainment, academia, education, the intelligentsia, big corporations, the government, just saying they're a peaceful organization, they're a peaceful organization, they're a peaceful organization. Now they can point to their wall and say, we won a Nobel Peace Prize, just like Nelson Mandela, just like Martin Luther King Jr., just like Barack Obama. Okay? So if you don't like that, you people are the problem, not us. It's another way to create warfare between Black Lives Matter and their opponents, and to paint their opponents as knuckle-dragging, red-necked, primordial racist ape men, basically. And they, of course, as the avenging angels of justice. That is what's going on here, gang. And that is story number one.